Welcome back everyone to another day in the shop. So I finally got these knives all hand sanded up to 600 grit. I'll touch them up again right before I install handles and bolsters, but what I've got here is a couple of my mosquito neck knives. They've been stone washed and they're coated in oil, wax, and I've got 3 swamp spikes here and a couple drop points. But if you notice, a couple of these swamp spikes have different logos on them, and that's because there's issues with them, then they will not leave my shop. In the last video, I went over a problem I had with one of these swamp spikes, and it had a crack in it. And what caused it? Carbide hammer. And I also found a crack in another one. And as I explained in the last video, those cracks were caused by getting too close to the spine and not spreading out my hammering as I was straightening them, just getting in too big of a hurry. It happens, and you just have to make precautions. Again, the knives are hard, they're tempered, but you're putting stress back into them. And if you stay in one spot too much and get close at the spine, cause a crack. Today's video is gonna be about putting on the bolsters on those drop points and handles on everything, except the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are neck knives and they'll have a Kydex sheath, low profile, lightweight. But I've got some 4/16 stainless, and I've got 2 pieces here glued together, and I've got a radius marked on them. The first thing I wanna do is cut the radius, clean it up, and then we'll go from there as far as drilling the holes, getting them ready to mount on the knives. There's a lot of things, a lot of steps we'll have to do to get to that point. So let's get started on getting the radiuses cut on these bolsters. So I got the profiles done and I've polished them. Now, these bolsters will not be flat like this. They're gonna have bevels right here that'll be cut down, and I'll leave about a nickel width on each bolster that'll have this semi-mirror finish. Now, there's several ways to do bolsters. You can solder them on, you can pin them on like I'm doing here, or you can weld them, forge weld them like I did on this knife right here. I prefer this method. It's cleaner. I don't risk overheating the knife, and you can't tear it off once it's done, and I'll show you why later in the video. Now, I was shown this method 25 years ago or so, maybe even longer, by Randy Captapal. At the time, they were getting away from soldering bolsters and going to pinning. Back then, everybody was pinning bolsters, and one of my favorite makers, Ron Gaston, that really inspired me. If you Google him, you can take a look at his knives and see the similarity in my bolsters and his and some of my knife patterns. Really loved his work. He's gone now. At the time, he was a premier maker and did some of the finest bolster work I ever seen. I've refined this method a few times, and I do it a little different than I was taught. But the first thing I want to do before I cut these bevels on the sides is I'm going to mount them on here with super glue, drill my pinholes through. They'll be deadly accurate that way. And then I will cut those bevels, separate these, and then I'm gonna cut inside bevels to give it that dovetail look. So let's get it done. So I've got them polished up to the final grit, but I still have one more step. I'm gonna put a wheel on here and run in the opposite direction to the previous scratches. And then I will do a little hand sanding for the final satin finish. But before I do that, I want to go ahead while I've got my jig set up in here and cut the 45s on my handle material. That way I don't move this and get it off, and my fit up will be a little better for that dovetail look. So these will be cut on the back side as well. I'll have to separate these after I do the final polishing on the front, turn them around and cut those 45s. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and 45 the handle material. So now that we got the bolsters all cleaned up, tapered, all the bevels done, now it's time to prepare to install them. And I'll be using pins that are pressed in to install them. But first we need to taper these holes. This is a 1/8 tapered reamer. It's 1/8 here, 3/16 up here. If you don't do that, you don't have any holding power. Once I taper these holes, they'll be mechanically connected to that knife and you can't tear them off. But when I go to ream these holes, I do them by hand. If you do them with a machine, you'll over ream them. I want to ream them until just the tip of this reamer touches the back of my hand here on my finger here. If you over ream it, you'll have slop. That's what we don't want to do. So I'm just going to hand ream these, just slowly getting in there and reaming them out. This is 4/16 stainless. It's in an annealed state, so it cuts pretty good. Okay, so we're there right now. The point is touching my finger. I don't want to go any further. So I'm just going to back out of there and we'll do the top one. And remember, you ream from the outside to the inside because you're going to be pressing and peening those. And when you're all done, those pins are ground down flush and profiled the way you want them. And you won't be able to see them because the pin material is the same steel as the bolster, 4/16 pin. Okay, I'm there now. So with the bolsters done, I thought I'd stop a minute and talk about this tool that I press the bolsters with. This is called a pin press. This was made for me by my father over 30 years ago. Back then they were pretty popular. Like I said before, everybody was using these and pinning bolsters. And these were for sale in just about every knife supply company. But they were expensive. And like all new makers and young folks, and even today, folks strapped for money, I couldn't afford it, so my dad made it for me. And it's basically some forklift tines, some threaded rods, some car hood springs like they used to put on the old cars. Many of you probably haven't never seen that before under a hood, and a hydraulic jack. And I've just got a base plate from an old pipe flange. The jack, I can let it all the way down and slide it out of there. Just like that. It just fits in a slot. They're not difficult to make. The actual pins are hardened sucker rod from the oil field, and they're just turned down to a taper. But I thought you might be interested in a little more detail on that. And if you're new to the channel and you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing. So before I put these handles on or drill the holes and all that stuff, I need to get these bolsters profiled. In other words, I'm going to shape them in an oval here, give them some, contouring here. But I do that before I put the handles on because it's going to build up some heat while I'm grinding, and I don't want a whole lot of heat when I start actually fitting the handles with the grinder to the bolsters. Be very little work there. So I want to eliminate as much heat as possible now and not worrying about heat buildup where I could damage the epoxy or whatever when I start grinding the handles. Let's get them profiled. Now with the scales done, I went ahead and done the decorative bevels on the front of these handles just like I did the bolsters. But I wanted to give you a little tip. This is micarta, and when you drill it, it shrinks. So after I drill the holes with the regular size bit that it needs, I take scales off and drill them with a larger hole, slightly larger, just like you saw in the video when I placed the scales along and drilled, I think I drilled the thong hole. I do that on all the pins, and you can see they're really tight. And that's after oversized drilling them, just slightly. It don't take much. So now I'm getting ready to drill the holes for the drop points. And if you notice how I've got this, I can't do both scales at one time like I did the micarta scales. A little different because of the dovetails and the shape of natural material, this textured bone. Now I've protected it, I'm clamped it, I'm going to clamp it over here also, and I've also put some painter's tape where the holes are going to exit. This helps to keep from splintering and damaging the material when the bit comes out and making a long splinter. It's going to make a little one anyway, and it's really hard to protect it on textured material anyway. If it's flat like ivory, some ancient ivory, something like that, mammoth, it's not so bad. But when you're dealing with stuff like abalone and mother of pearl, you really have to protect it. I'm going to be grinding some of this away anyway, but I don't want long splinters. But I've got it clamped up. One other tip, because this is dovetailed, I've got it clamped, but I'm going to take a hammer and bump it to make sure it's fully seated in those dovetails, and then drill the holes. I'll do that on both scales. Then we'll be ready for preparing these for glue up. All right, with all the holes drilled, everything's cleaned, and we're ready to glue up. But before we do, there's one more thing I want to show you, and that is how I prepare my scales. If you see there, there's dimples drilled all up and down the scales. I do that to all of my scales, and I think it gives a little extra security there. Is it necessary? Probably not, but I always do it. Just something extra that I do. It takes a little more epoxy because you're filling in all those voids. But I'm going to get all these glued up, and then we'll cut to finishing these out after the glue dries. I am done with this set of knives. Got some shots of the finished knives I'm going to show you here. But first, if you got any comments, leave them down below. I want to thank my patrons, and I want to thank you for watching. We're going to see you on the next one. Now, here's some shots of the finished blades.